Because there is breaking news happening. There is a verdict in the Tim Mapes trial. This trial has been going on for a little bit more than 2 weeks. After 5 hours, I think it's about 5 hours of deliberations, we now know that there is a verdict.
The jury yesterday wanted to go home early. They sent a note to the judge asking if they could come back at 9 a.m. this morning. So that deliberation, as you mentioned, Judy, did not last long. Mapes was charged with 1 count of making false declarations before a grand jury and 1 count of attempted obstruction of justice. As you know, he served as Madigan's chief of staff for many years and accused of lying to a grand jury during its investigation into a bribery scheme involving Madigan and ComEd. Those are the charges right there that he faced.
We have our Sarah Schulte, who has been in the courtroom covering this trial from the beginning. So we just got word, Sarah, that the verdict is guilty on both counts. Is that correct?
That is correct, Judy. Guilty on both counts, perjury and obstruction of justice. You know, it didn't take long for this federal jury to come up with a verdict. They began deliberating this morning at 9 o'clock. Shortly before noon, they came and they gave a note to the judge saying they wanted a copy or a transcript. They wanted to listen to the grand jury testimony. And then about a couple hours after that, they announced that there was a verdict. Now, this was a case that centered around Tim Mapes' memory and how he answered 7 questions out of 500 during grand jury proceedings over 2 years ago. Federal prosecutors say he violated the integrity of the grand jury process by lying several times. Michael Madigan's former longtime chief of staff was testifying under immunity during an ongoing investigation into an alleged bribery scheme involving Madigan. Now, prosecutors say the point of the questioning was to gather insight into the relationship between Madigan and his longtime trusted advisor, Michael McLean. Now, known in Springfield to be very meticulous and dedicated to details, Mapes failed to remember some very basic questions about whether McLean did assignments for Madigan during a 3-year period. Now, prosecutors told jurors during closing arguments yesterday that Mapes could have been a star witness. Instead, he chose to protect Madigan. Now, it was a trial that lasted close to 2 weeks. The government presented 14 witnesses and dozens of wiretap phone conversations and documents to prove their case. The defense said that Mapes answered the questions honestly and fairly given the circumstances. In the closing argument yesterday, Mapes' attorney says Mapes had actually no motive to protect Madigan since the former Illinois House Speaker fired Mapes over a sexual harassment and bullying allegations back in 2018. Again, Mapes has been found guilty, certainly on 2 counts. I'm going to bring in Craig Wall, our political reporter, who was also here at the beginning of the trial for openings and some other days. What are your thoughts on this, Craig?
My thoughts are that the wiretaps must have played a really important role in all of this, because Mapes had said that he didn't remember a lot of stuff, that McLean would not have told him inside details about conversations that he would have had with Madigan about these various assignments that Madigan wanted him to do as this trusted advisor. But the wiretaps that were played in court seemingly undermined that, and I imagine when the jury looked at what Mapes had to gain by lying versus what was said on those wiretaps, that turned out to be a very convincing aspect for them. Hopefully we can hear from some of the jurors maybe to give us some insight into how those deliberations went, but obviously it didn't take them very long in their deliberations, so the evidence must have been pretty convincing.
No, absolutely, not long at all, especially here in the federal building. Sometimes juries take several days to come up with stuff because they're presented with so much evidence, and they were presented, even though this was a pretty simple case. We're talking about 2 counts, perjury and obstruction of justice. It was a simple case, but they also had a lot in front of them. As you said, they had, these wiretaps that they had to listen to. They had lots of documents. There were over 14 witnesses on the prosecution side, 4 witnesses on the defense side. So there was still a lot to go over. But in the end, it ended up being probably pretty simple, especially since they had so many of those phone conversations between Mapes and Michael McLean.
Interesting, though, because some of the legal experts that I've spoken to early on had talked about how perjury cases can oftentimes be very difficult ones to process, because it's really, did that person remember it or did they not? And the defense had tried to make the case there that, many times people just don't remember specific details. Prosecutors knew the answers to the questions that they were asking, almost kind of to set them up and trip them up. But as we've seen, the jury didn't buy that defense, didn't buy that he didn't remember things, obviously looked at it and said, oh, how convenient, these critical elements that would have pointed critically to Mike Madigan and to his potential culpability they did not buy that.
No, and yesterday during closing arguments, the defense called these events that Mapes was supposed to remember as kind of insignificant legal events. So there was no reason for him to remember some of these events. But some of these events that he was supposed to remember were on during phone conversations. So that's probably definitely what did it. One of them was former State Representative Lou Lang that involved him, and it was Michael Madigan gave Michael McLean the assignment
to take care of stuff for him.
Of taking care of stuff for him, and also the one big assignment he gave him was to tell Lou Lang to resign, and that is something that apparently Mapes claims that he doesn't remember.
And that is one of those things that would be significant enough. Lou Lang was another close associate of Madigan, somebody who not necessarily in his tight inner circle, who was in that outer inner circle, and that seems implausible, and the jury seems to back up that argument that he wouldn't remember something as significant as that. And so, we'll have to see. This obviously brings prosecutors even closer to Mike Madigan, who's got his own trial coming up with Michael McLean on racketeering next spring. So this is another notch in the prosecutor's belt, if you will, in their corruption investigations.
It is another notch in the prosecutor's belt, but they did lose Mapes in this. I mean, the one thing that they brought up yesterday in closing arguments is that, Tim Mapes could have been a star government witness in the Madigan case, in the Madigan trial. And so they do not have Tim Mapes now for that.
And to that point, what that really speaks to, and we saw play out in this trial, is that if you were in Mike Madigan's inner circle, you were so fiercely loyal to him that you would take a bullet for him. Michael McLean went down convicted in the ComEd 4 earlier this year because he wouldn't, tell prosecutors what they wanted to hear. And we see that with Tim Mapes here. The influence and the power and the control that Michael Madigan exerted when he was in power still lingers on, and people are not going to even what's interesting, they're so old at this point. What do they have to lose by turning?
Well, and the interesting thing about this is that Tim Mapes took a bullet for Michael Madigan after Michael Madigan fired him.
Right.
I mean, this grand jury testimony where he lied during the grand jury was in 2021, and Tim Mapes was fired by Michael Madigan over sexual harassment and bullying charges back in 2018.
Right.
So think about it. I mean, that is 3 years later, he was still trying to protect the boss.
Well, and was this firing more for the optics? We remember this is in the heat of the Me Too moment, Me Too movement, when so much was happening in Springfield. Michael Madigan's power was in flux at that point, and he obviously ended up losing the speakership. But this was at a point where he had to do something to make it look to the rest of the Democratic caucus in the House that he was taking charge, that he was holding people accountable for what was going on. And Tim Mapes, of course, had been accused of bullying and sexual harassing somebody who was in the Madigan circle, Sherry Garrett. And she put out a statement today addressing that issue. But, this is one of these things where, was he really fired because Madigan wanted to punish him, or was it to save Madigan's own skin?
Right, and probably to save his own skin, correct? All right, that is the latest from here. We'll hopefully be hearing from both the prosecution and defense when they hopefully come down in a few minutes. Live at the Dirksen Federal Building with Craig Waller, political reporter Sarah Schulte, ABC 7 News. Back to you.
Thanks to the both of you. The judge sentencing that date tentatively set for January 10th of next year at 9:30 a.m. The judge, though, saying in the courtroom that date could change, but right now sentencing set for January 10th, 2024.
Our appreciation to Craig Wall and also Sarah Schulte standing by. They're standing by. We'll go back to them as soon as somebody comes down to that courtroom lobby to speak. But right now we can bring in our ABC 7 legal contributor, Tony Thetford, who has been watching this case, of course, along with our reporters. Tony, thank you. Appreciate your time standing by with us. So I guess we'll jump right into it. Your thoughts. Only about 5 hours in total of jury deliberations before the guilty verdict.
I think it was a bit quick because there were 8 days of presentation at trial, but only based on that. A lot of the trial comprised of them playing some audio that was recorded and witnesses sort of going through, the paces in terms of their evidence. So it wasn't extremely complex, but I am surprised that the jury verdict came back in 5 hours, although it was my belief that they would reach a verdict today.
Tony, he did not testify in his own defense, and it was unclear whether he might, the defense not taking as long as the prosecution to present its case. Want to get your thoughts on Tim Mapes not testifying in this trial where he's now been found guilty?
Well, you know, it's generally problematic. I think most defense lawyers, like myself, our knee-jerk reaction is to keep a defendant off of the stand. That is not to suggest that he would not have given good testimony or that he would have been lying, only that once a defendant testifies, the weakness or the argued weakness of the government's case sort of shifts and the focus becomes on the defendant. And if he missteps at all, the whole case can collapse. So it does not surprise me that he did not testify. And honestly, these were very simple charges. There were only two counts, the obstruction count and the perjury count. So the issue for the jury was rather simple, whether or not they believed that he was telling the truth when he said he didn't remember specific things. And unfortunately here, those things that he didn't remember seem to coalesce around this relationship between McClain and former Speaker Madigan and appeared suspect. And so I think that the jury could reasonably surmise that the government's case was proven even within that time frame, although I believe it was rather brief.
And Tony, do you make anything of the question this morning? The jury essentially only had a couple of questions this morning, asking, I believe, for the grand jury testimony and also just the verdict or the indictment printed out for every single juror. What do we make of that?
Well, as to the grand jury transcript, I think that that's pretty obvious. The core of this case was what Mr. Mapes said or didn't say in the grand jury and how he, in fact, answered those 500 questions. Again, there are only 7 questions here at trial that were at issue related to whether or not he perjured himself when he testified. So it is logical, and it is the jury performing their duty and doing their job to look back at that transcript to see if they can reach those conclusions. In terms of, I think the other thing that they wanted, I can't quite remember, what was the other request that they made?
I think they wanted a copy of the indictment so that every single juror can have a copy of it. And they asked for that just this morning, really a couple hours before the verdict came in.
And that is interesting from this standpoint. The jury gets jury instructions. The counts in the indictment or the issues that they are to decide are actually printed on the jury instructions that they received. So often jurors don't see the actual indictment in the case, although they're entitled to it. It was read to them at the beginning of the trial, and it's obviously a part of the case. So why they wanted the actual indictment in this case, I cannot guess at this point. The machinations of a jury and what they find to be important, regardless of our perceived expertise, remains a mystery to many of us because they'll follow their own path to reach the outcome in the case, which is what they did here. So I'm not quite sure why they needed the indictment, but certainly they appear to attempt to be thorough in their analysis in this case.
And perhaps we'll hear from that jury. ABC 7 legal contributor Tony Thetford joining us talking about the guilty verdict for Tim Mapes. One man has not gone to trial yet, and that's Tim Mapes' boss, Michael Madigan. We've had the so-called ComEd bribery case and now this case. Tony, I want to get your thoughts on what this verdict may, how it could impact Michael Madigan's trial, which is scheduled for next year.
Well, I will tell you, first of all, it would be difficult for Michael Madigan's defense team if they chose to call Mapes because he's now a convicted felon, among other things. Now, again, the original intent certainly was not for the defense team to call Mr. Mapes because he was the government's witness. But he's no longer the government's witness. He's a defendant who was found guilty of felony charges. So it will be interesting as to how his current status would affect the analysis that Madigan's defense team uses in terms of how they address any issues with Mr. Mapes. However, Madigan's indictment is different, and frankly, Mapes' participation in this trial, or forced participation in this trial, as it were, is not really relevant to the issues that former Speaker Madigan is charged with. Obviously, he's going to trial with Mr. McClain. Michael McClain was already found guilty in the ComEd 4 trial. These are separate issues. So again, there could be some overlap and some strategic decisions that are made based on the current status of Mapes. Certainly the government has had to do that because they cannot use Mr. Mapes as a witness against Speaker Madigan, former Speaker Madigan, but how this actually plays out, and we have several months until that trial is to commence. We'll have to see what strategies are employed by both sides for purposes of potentially leveraging this verdict that was reached today.
And Tony, in terms of courtroom logistics, what happens after now? So the verdict is in for Tim Mapes. He awaits sentencing. Do you know what the guidelines are right now?
Well, there's a statutory maximum of 20 years on the obstruction charge, and there's a statutory maximum of 5 years on the perjury charge. He was found guilty of both. So there's potential sentencing up to 20 years. However, and I don't know his guideline range, that would depend on a number of factors. I would guess that the guideline range is nowhere near 20 years in this case. He is probably facing a few years in prison. He is 68 years old. There are a lot of factors that will go into what the sentence ultimately is. His lawyers and defense team will make arguments in mitigation. They will present documents, witnesses perhaps, to give information about Mr. Mapes that would tend to suggest to the court that he should not be sent to prison. And again, that would be, at this moment, the fight of the defense team, as well as attacking what they will likely believe to be error in the trial and attempt to get him a new trial. So there are a lot of things that are going to happen right now. The primary thing for Mr. Mapes, though, is whether or not he's taken into custody based on this verdict. My assumption is that he won't be taken into custody. He's not a flight risk. He is not someone who's a danger to the community as he remains released. And so I assume that those conversations are being had right now in the courtroom, or have been had. And I would not expect that Mr. Mapes would go into custody today.
Yeah, right on cue, Tony. Our team of reporters is back at the Dirksen Federal Building, I believe, with an update. So we want to thank you, but stay connected
really
with us. The big question would be, did Tim Mapes leave today? Let's go to our team of reporters who are there to tell us, because they should have some new information on that and what else happened in the courtroom. It's Craig, Sarah, and Liz Nagy, too. So we've got quite a few folks down there helping us out. Let's start with Sarah.
Well, Rob, yes, right. Tim Mapes did leave. It's pretty customary that when someone is found guilty in a federal building that they are sentenced at a later date, and usually for this type of crime, not taken into custody right away. They'll be sentenced and then obviously had to report to prison once they get that sentence. But Tim Mapes left, obviously, with not talking to anybody. He left the federal building with his attorneys. Hopefully, we hope to hear from his attorneys later on, but he did leave with his attorneys. You can probably see some video right now of him leaving without saying anything. Of course, he did not really say anything to anybody during this whole trial, including many reporters who covered him and knew him quite well in Springfield. They also found it kind of uncomfortable that they all knew Tim Mapes pretty well, but Tim never even kind of looked at any of these reporters. Joining me right now is my colleague Liz Nagy. She was in the courtroom, and she can tell us a little bit about Tim Mapes when that verdict was read.
Really, there was no reaction at all from Tim Mapes. There was a very short reading of the verdict. There were just 2 counts. The judge read count 1, guilty. There was no reaction from the jury. There was no reaction from anybody in the courtroom, including his team of defense attorneys. Tim Mapes just kind of sat there. I guess you could say stone-faced, but it wasn't even really a deliberate stoic look on his face. He was just, and you said that that's kind of how he's been throughout the entire time. Then the second count came down. They said guilty, and the defense. I thought it was interesting. The defense didn't even ask for the jury to be polled. Sometimes they want to know if this was a unanimous verdict or anything like that, and nobody in the courtroom even asked for the jury to be polled, which I thought was a little bit interesting.
You know, I have a feeling probably the defense, when they knew that this verdict came down at around 2:30 this afternoon, when it only just been a few short hours that the jury was deliberating, they probably had a feeling maybe of what the verdict was going to be at this point.
Right, and that sounds like it was the case. They got the case just yesterday afternoon at 4:35. They left shortly after that, so it was not even an entire day of deliberations that they went through.
No, they actually just started deliberating at 9 o'clock this morning. You know, Tim Mapes certainly was paying very close attention during the trial. He was taking a lot of notes. He was listening very intensely to most of the testimony. You know, in Springfield, he was known as a very meticulous and detailed-oriented guy, so certainly not a surprise that he was paying so close attention to what was going on in the courtroom. But of course, when a verdict is being read and it's about your fate, that's kind of a whole different situation. There's many situations where lots of times defendants do sit there stone-faced.
Right, and I think you have a good point there in saying that this sort of seemed like a fait accompli. I mean, there's often a very heavy tension in a courtroom right before a verdict is read. There was not sort of this rush of people into the courtroom as there normally is. It was not a packed courtroom by any means. There wasn't even any real suspense from the jury. So it did sort of seem like as though everybody involved knew what was coming. The judge afterwards did ask prosecution, the government, if they wanted to set a trial date. The government said they did want to set a trial date. They would feel most comfortable doing that. The defense said they would feel most comfortable if they sort of worked out the post-trial motions. The judge said very deliberately that he was going to take a path down the middle. He set that sentencing date for Tim Mapes farther out than he said he would typically do. It's set for January 10th at 9:30 in the morning. But he also set that with the understanding that that may or may not be moved. So just a few months from now, Tim Mapes will be sentenced. I think you said he could serve up to 20 years in prison.
Could serve up to 20 years in prison. So the interesting thing about this, the one thing that during the trial the prosecutors were trying to get across is this triangle, this very, very close relationship between Michael Madigan, Michael McClain, and Tim Mapes. And they described Tim Mapes as a guy who was the gatekeeper for Michael Madigan. And all three of them, were McClain and Mapes were kind of the gatekeepers for Madigan. And now you think about it. Tim Mapes and Michael McClain both now have been found guilty. And we have a trial that's coming up in May for Michael Madigan.
And you have often referred to this sort of as the wind-up to Michael Madigan. This is a very detail-oriented thing that the jury had to work through, but this is all sort of leading up to the big thing of Michael Madigan. We are being told by our colleague Craig Wall just now that the prosecution is not coming down. The prosecution is not going to talk. So do you find that significant, or...?
I think that maybe they're not talking because you have to think of what we were just talking about. This is the big picture. They still have a big trial coming up in May with Michael Madigan, and I think they probably want to keep things close to the vest right now and not comment.
Yeah, so we're not going to be hearing from the prosecution. It'll be interesting to see if we hear from Tim Mapes' team. They were packing up their binders coming down, took a separate elevator, I noticed, deliberately from the media, which is often the case from the 21st floor. Prosecution will not be coming down, so we'll wait to see what happens.
Yep, we will. Back to you guys.
All right, Liz Nagy and Sarah Schulte, thank you so much for your coverage right there. I want to bring back in Tony Thetford and get his thoughts on what Liz and Sarah were just talking about. Hopefully, Tony, you had a chance to kind of listen in. The fact that they felt when they were in the courtroom and the verdict was about to be read that there wasn't this sense of suspense almost, that it almost felt like it was a done deal. Your thoughts on that?
Yes, whenever there is a quick verdict, it usually is bad for the defendant. It is not always the case, especially on a case where it seems pretty clear that the defense is winning. But on a case, kind of hope is lost pretty early on if the verdict comes back as quickly as this did. So I would imagine that the defense team's instincts clearly were right, and their instincts must have been that this was not a great outcome for their client. So I think that's what we saw in the courtroom today.
Tony, one more question for you. Typically, from your experience, are perjury cases like this, are they difficult, much more difficult to prove?
I think that a perjury case is difficult to prove if it is perjury essentially by omission. In this case, Mr. Mapes was being tried not for what he said, but for what he didn't say, for denying knowledge of certain facts that the government believed that he knew. And so in that case, it is difficult. And it is also difficult because they've got to get past any explanations that may be given for him potentially misspeaking or misunderstanding. And I think that it is a difficult case to prove unless there is this smoking gun of him having said something that clearly wasn't true. So I up until this verdict, my gut did not necessarily tell me that this was a slam dunk for the government.
Surprised the prosecution is not coming down to talk. So before we let you go, I have reporters saying that they're not, usually when you win a case, you come down, you stand before the media, you thank the jury, and you talk about why you won.
Well, this is a second act in a three-act play. So Act 1 was the ComEd 4 trial that McClain was involved in and found guilty. Act 2 is this one. And then Act 3 will be the ultimate case for former Speaker Madigan. So I think it is wise for the government to stand down at this moment and maybe talk about these outcomes in total if they get the outcome that they want as a part of a continuum as it relates specifically to former Speaker Madigan. So it does not surprise me that they did not speak after this trial, since it is one piece in a larger puzzle that they're trying to put together.
Makes sense. They're waiting for that final curtain, I suppose. All right, Tony Thedford, thank you so much for your time and your insight.
Corey, good to see you guys.
You as well. Thanks to our reporters out there at the Federal Building. We're going to continue to gather more information, see if we can get any reaction from jurors or either side in this case. But again, Tim Mapes found guilty today. That jury deliberating, as you mentioned, not long.
And we'll be right back here for Eyewitness News at 4 o'clock on ABC 7. So hopefully we will see you then.
This has been an ABC 7 Eyewitness News special report.